You're walking through a cotton field in 1850 Georgia when you hear a sound that makes your blood freeze. A young woman, barely 18, screams as her newborn baby is torn from her arms and handed to a white woman who paid $300 for the privilege. The mother will never see her child again, and this transaction was as legal and routine as buying livestock at market. What you're about to discover comes from plantation records, court documents, and testimonies that reveal how an entire economic system built its prosperity on the systematic brutalization of African American women in ways so calculated and cruel that documenting them becomes an exercise in confronting America's most horrific legacy. These weren't isolated incidents or regional aberrations. They were institutional practices that reduced human beings to breeding stock, where a woman's value was measured by her capacity to produce more enslaved laborers and satisfy the sexual appetites of her owners. The horrors we'll explore weren't exceptions to the rule of slavery. They were the foundation upon which the plantation economy operated for over 2 centuries. Before we continue, if you're interested in understanding the untold truths of American history, consider subscribing and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It's powerful that we can confront these difficult realities together from different parts of the world, united by our need to understand the past, no matter how uncomfortable it makes us. The most psychologically devastating aspect of female enslavement began before these women could form coherent memories. Young girls were systematically prepared for lives of sexual exploitation through training programs that would make modern trafficking operations seem primitive by comparison. The case of Sally provides a window into this methodical grooming process that transformed children into commodities. Sally was likely born on a Virginia plantation around 1820, but her birthplace matters less than what happened to her after she turned 12. Her owner, a man named Thomas Whitfield, recognized something that would generate enormous profits over the coming decades: the potential for both sexual exploitation and reproductive value. Whitfield had developed an expertise that reads like the resume of a nightmare. He could identify which young enslaved girls would develop into the most desirable women, and he had perfected a system designed to maximize their value through systematic abuse. The process was terrifyingly methodical. Whitfield selected Sally and 4 other girls when they reached puberty, housing them in a separate cabin where they underwent what he called special preparation. This preparation involved daily sessions where these children were taught to submit to sexual demands without resistance, to anticipate the needs of white men, and to suppress any natural emotional responses that might interfere with their usefulness. The training itself reveals the calculated nature of this exploitation. These girls weren't simply abused randomly. They were educated in the specific behaviors that would make them valuable to potential buyers or renters. They learned to remain silent during assault, to clean themselves efficiently afterward, and to present themselves attractively despite the trauma they endured daily. The curriculum was comprehensive and horrifying, covering everything from physical positioning to psychological techniques for dissociation. But the sexual preparation was only one dimension of their commodification. Sally and the others were simultaneously trained as domestic workers, learning cooking, cleaning, and childcare skills that would make them multi-purpose investments for their eventual purchasers. This dual training created women who could serve every conceivable function within a household, maximizing their economic value while ensuring their complete subjugation. When Sally reached 16, the final phase of her commodification began. Whitfield advertised her virginity in local newspapers, describing her physical attributes with the same clinical detail used for livestock auctions. The bidding process took place in public squares, where potential buyers examined her body, tested her responsiveness to commands, and negotiated prices based on her anticipated productivity in both labor and reproduction. The price commanded for Sally's initial sexual exploitation reveals the economic scale of this system. A single night with a virgin enslaved woman could cost more than most free workers earned in 6 months. After this transaction, Sally faced a future that offered no possibility of escape or improvement. She became what plantation records coldly termed a breeder, expected to produce children who would become the property of her owner. The breeding programs operated throughout the American South represent perhaps the most systematic dehumanization in human history. Enslaved women were paired with enslaved men specifically chosen for physical characteristics that owners believed would produce valuable offspring. These forced couplings had nothing to do with affection, compatibility, or consent. They were calculated breeding experiments designed to increase plantation wealth through human reproduction. The documentation of these practices exists in disturbing detail because plantation owners were meticulous record keepers who saw nothing shameful in their actions. Breeding ledgers tracked which women had been impregnated, when children were expected, and how much each birth would add to the plantation's asset value. Female enslaved people were listed alongside livestock in estate inventories, with their reproductive capacity noted as a primary source of their worth. The forced pregnancies created impossible situations for enslaved women who faced choices that no human being should ever confront. Plantation owners typically demanded that pregnant women continue working in the fields until the moment of labor, often resulting in miscarriages and birth complications that caused permanent damage or death. The women who survived childbirth faced immediate separation from their newborns, who were often sold before they could walk or talk. The psychological manipulation employed to maintain this system was as sophisticated as it was devastating. Enslaved women were told that resistance would result in the sale of their existing children to distant plantations, where they would never see them again. This threat proved more effective than physical violence in maintaining compliance, as mothers would endure any abuse to protect their offspring from even worse fates. The medical experiments conducted on enslaved women reveal another dimension of systematic brutalization that defies comprehension. Plantation owners and doctors used enslaved women as test subjects for procedures that were considered too dangerous to perform on white patients. These experiments were conducted without anesthesia, consent, or any consideration for the subject's well-being. The most notorious of these medical torturers was Dr. James Marion Sims, who performed dozens of surgical experiments on enslaved women in Alabama during the 1840s. His procedures, designed to treat conditions that were often caused by the brutal working conditions and repeated pregnancies forced upon these women, were conducted in full view of other enslaved people as a form of psychological intimidation. The normalization of this violence throughout Southern society created a culture where the systematic abuse of African American women was viewed not as criminal behavior, but as routine property management. The legal system provided no protection for enslaved women because they were not recognized as human beings, capable of giving or withholding consent for anything that happened to their bodies. The court records from Charleston, South Carolina, reveal a legal framework so morally bankrupt that it defies modern comprehension. When an enslaved woman named Maria was repeatedly assaulted by her owner's son, she was the one punished for tempting him with her presence. The legal reasoning stated that enslaved women existed in a permanent state of availability, making the concept of rape legally impossible since property cannot be violated by its owner. This wasn't an isolated judicial decision or the twisted logic of a single corrupt judge. It represented the systematic legal doctrine that governed the treatment of enslaved women throughout the American South for over 2 centuries. The courts consistently ruled that enslaved women had no right to bodily autonomy, no protection from sexual violence, and no legal recourse when their children were sold away from them. The testimony requirements for enslaved people in legal proceedings created additional layers of horror that extended far beyond individual cases. When enslaved women were permitted to testify in court, which was extremely rare, they were required to give their statements while being whipped. Southern legal tradition held that enslaved people would only tell the truth under physical duress, so torture became a prerequisite for judicial participation. The documentation shows that many women died during these interrogations. their bodies literally destroyed in the process of extracting testimony that might have no bearing on the case at hand. The judges who presided over these proceedings saw nothing unusual in requiring torture as a condition for legal testimony, treating human suffering as a necessary component of their judicial process. But the courtroom tortures were only one manifestation of the systematic violence that governed every aspect of enslaved women's lives. The punishment methods used on plantations were designed not just to inflict pain, but to serve as public warnings to other enslaved people about the consequences of resistance or disobedience. The whipping posts that stood in the centers of plantation compounds were carefully positioned to ensure maximum visibility during punishment sessions. Enslaved women were stripped naked and beaten while their families and fellow workers were forced to watch, creating trauma that extended throughout the entire enslaved community. The psychological impact of witnessing these tortures was as calculated as the physical damage inflicted on the victims. The implements used for these punishments reveal the methodical cruelty that characterized plantation discipline. Cat-o'-nine tails were specifically designed to tear flesh with each blow, while iron brands created permanent scarring that marked women as property for the remainder of their lives. Some plantations employed specialized torture devices like thumbscrews and iron masks that prevented speech while allowing the wearer to work. The branding process itself was conducted with ceremonial precision that emphasized the complete ownership of human beings. Enslaved women were held down while red-hot irons burned identifying marks into their skin, usually on the face or breast, where the scarring would be permanently visible. These brands served multiple purposes, identifying ownership, marking punishment, and providing constant psychological reminders of their status as property. The iron masks forced onto enslaved women who were deemed too vocal or resistant represent perhaps the most psychologically devastating form of punishment employed in the plantation system. These devices covered the entire head, with small holes for breathing and eating, but prevented normal speech or social interaction. Women were forced to wear these masks for weeks or months, isolated even while working alongside other enslaved people. The sexual violence that permeated plantation life extended beyond individual assault to systematic programs of exploitation that generated substantial profits for owners. Some plantations operated what can only be described as forced prostitution networks, where enslaved women were rented out to neighboring plantations, traveling businessmen, and local white men seeking sexual services. The rental agreements for these arrangements survive in plantation records, detailing the prices charged for different types of sexual access and the expected duration of these transactions. Enslaved women had no control over these arrangements and received no compensation for their exploitation. The profits flowed entirely to their owners, who treated sexual assault as just another form of income generation. The breeding farms that operated throughout the Upper South represent the complete transformation of human reproduction into commercial enterprise. These facilities were specifically designed to maximize the production of enslaved children, who could be sold to cotton plantations in the Deep South. Women were evaluated like livestock, with their reproductive history and physical characteristics determining their value in this horrific marketplace. The selection process for breeding programs involved detailed physical examinations that reduced women to their biological functions. Plantation owners kept extensive records tracking menstrual cycles, pregnancy outcomes, and the survival rates of children born to different women. This data informed decisions about which women would be forced into reproductive roles and which men fathers would be selected as. The forced separations of mothers from their children created scenes of human anguish that even some plantation owners found difficult to witness. The account of a slave auction in Richmond, Virginia, describes mothers clinging to their babies while buyers pried their hands loose, often breaking fingers in the process. The children were sold to buyers from different states, ensuring that families could never be reunited, even if individual members somehow gained their freedom. The international slave trade that continued illegally after 1808 brought fresh horrors to enslaved women who survived the Middle Passage, only to face systematic brutalization in American markets. These women, torn from their families and cultures in Africa, arrived in Charleston, New Orleans, and Savannah to face immediate sexual exploitation by traders who viewed them as exotic commodities for wealthy buyers. The seasoning process used to prepare newly arrived African women for plantation work involved systematic violence designed to break their spirits and eliminate any thoughts of resistance or escape. This training typically lasted several months and included regular beatings, sexual assault, and forced labor under the most brutal conditions imaginable. The systematic brutalization of African American women under slavery reveals how entire societies can construct elaborate justifications for the most heinous crimes against humanity. These women's stolen lives built the cotton fields we romanticize today, their forced labor financing the grand plantations that tourists visit, without understanding the screams that once echoed through those halls. The evidence sits in archives across the American South, meticulously documented by a society that saw nothing wrong with reducing human beings to breeding stock and sexual commodities. Understanding this history isn't about assigning blame to modern Americans or dismissing the complexity of historical periods. It's about recognizing how easily entire populations can become complicit in systematic dehumanization when it serves economic interests and social structures. The voices of these enslaved women have been largely silenced by history, but their stories demand to be heard as reminders that civilization's greatest achievements often rest on foundations of unimaginable cruelty. The next time you see a historical plantation or read about the antebellum South, remember Sally and Maria and the countless unnamed women whose suffering made that world possible. Their legacy isn't just pain, but the strength they showed in surviving systems designed to destroy their humanity completely.